used to, brilliant, that's us recording now, thanks Potenza. I think we're all getting used to speaking at online events and what to do, but just a quick reminder that while the speakers are talking today, if you can mute yourself, just so we don't get any feedback. There will be time for questions at the end of each presentation. So if you think of something you want to ask as we go along, just pop it in the chat, and there will be chairs in each session who will be able to put your questions to the speakers when we get to the end of the session. I think that's everything I wanted to say for now, other than I hope you all enjoy the day. So I will go on and introduce our first keynote speaker. Thanks so much for coming along today to Dr. Andrew Cox. He's Senior Lecturer at the Information School at University of Sheffield, and he's the author of the CILIP review that came out recently on the impact of AI, machine learning and automation for libraries and librarians. And this morning, he's going to tell us a little bit more about this work. So without any further ado, I shall hand over to Andrew, if you're there.
Yes, thank you very much, Lindsay. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, yeah, this work that I'm going to talk about has been recently published in a report, and I've just posted the link to the report in the chat. So if you want to get hold of that, that'd be really useful. So let me just share my screen. So the title of my talk is Health Information Professionals and Artificial Intelligence. So I'm from the Information School at Sheffield. Hopefully you may have heard of us. We're a kind of educator in the area of information professional work. Of course, artificial intelligence is a topic that we're all hearing a lot about through many, many different channels. I mean, it seems to be something everybody's producing a report on. And the UK government, the Scottish government as well, have produced national AI strategies. European Commission is thinking about legislation, which is interesting in terms of a more legislative approach, perhaps. Certainly in the health sector, obviously NHSX has produced a number of reports kind of talking about how AI can be applied in the area of health work. But we're also seeing things like UCRI, the big funding body for research across higher education, is come out with a report sort of emphasizing how they're going to invest in AI. So AI is a massive topic for us all, I guess. I'm not a health, my talk is really quite generic. It's from a broad information professional background. I'm not a health person, so I hope it's going to feel relevant. I mean, the applications of AI to health are obviously critical ones in drug discovery. You can think of obvious examples of how AI could be applied, such as in filtering through huge numbers of, say, medical images to detect early signs of a particular condition. That could be very, very powerful. It's incredibly advantageous, the potential benefits of that. Equally, we know there's been a lot of controversy around AI. So if all your medical images are, say, from the majority white population, and given that we know that the BAME community are kind of not using health services like we want them to, that might mean their representation in our historic data is even less than when they're already a minority. That could mean that there could be inequalities in how this kind of technology could work. So I think AI is super exciting. It is a big part of this digital transformation everybody's talking about, but it also has prompted a huge amount of ethical concern. I just kind of want to talk about both those things. And I think recent announcement on the 20th of October about some projects to apply AI in the health sector in more ethical ways, I think it's really interesting. If you look closely at that, they're doing exactly what we would want in terms of thinking about, okay, how can we use a chatbot to explain medical conditions to people, but also how acceptable is that to different communities. Yeah, we're going to use AI to filter images, but again, how acceptable is that to different stakeholders in our organizations? We need work on data standards. So I think AI is a very, very exciting topic, but it's kind of got this kind of dualistic element. And so my talk is like really broken down to two elements. First, I want to say, what do I think AI means? And just being an academic, I like to make things slightly more complicated maybe than they need to be. I've got about 5 or 6 different definitions, but I think they all have some value to us to trying to make sense of what these technologies mean to us. And the second part of the talk is more thinking directly about information professionals in general, but I think it applies very much to people who work in health sector and health libraries. What do we bring that is distinctive and unique and a value in an AI world? Because I think we do bring quite a lot of really valuable things. And it's not about us all having to become data scientists. I don't really think that. I think we can go on being librarians, information professionals. We have to extend what we do a bit, perhaps, to a data world, to an AI world, but I don't think that invalidates the kind of things we already do. We're not going to be swept away by automation, I don't think, as a profession. That's the positive message, I think, of my report. So, okay, so the first part of my talk is really trying to kind of get at, well, what is artificial intelligence? Because we hear a lot about it, quite a lot of hype about it, but what does it really boil down to? So my first definition is talking about artificial intelligence as something we counter all the time. So when we're doing, at Sheffield, we use Google documents. So your text is automatically corrected, or suggestions are made. When I start to write an email, it starts to finish it for me. Often very useful, often rather irritating. Things like grammar checking. Also things like, in this very event, we've got the captioning turned on. That's basically artificial intelligence application. It kind of works. It works well enough to be useful. I'm really excited about translation tools because I realized I can now access, say, a paper written in Spanish or Chinese, or even maybe Arabic. I can access that paper at some level to understand roughly what the point of that paper is. And that's really opening my world up to a much wider range of knowledge. And we're all about, making access to knowledge better. And so things like translation tools, captioning, that's really useful. Automatic writing. A couple of years ago, Springer announced the publication of the first book was basically written by a computer. It's a book about batteries, lithium batteries, which is basically a kind of synthesis of the literature written automatically by a computer. So there's a mix there of things that have been around for a while, and many of the features of search and recommendation we see on Google and on Amazon. These are things we've been, as information professionals, aware of for a decade at least. And I think they are AI, but it's a moving front of new things. The translation tools are getting better. The transcriptions getting better and better. The captioning is getting better and better. So I think these tools are really important. What AI means, it tells us a couple of things. It tells us, oh, well, we've really encountered AI already. We shouldn't be too scared by the term. We should recognize that AI has actually challenged us as information professionals. Things like Google have challenged the role of librarians, but I think we've fought back and actually shown we are needed. It's not like everyone's going to trust a Google search to find all their information. Or if they are, they shouldn't be. So I think we can be positive about how AI has already affected us and how it's going to go on affecting us, and be confident we can adjust to that and continue to make a really valuable contribution in terms of things like the bottom of the slide I mentioned. But we still need critical information literacy, because you can't take these new automated tools for granted. They're doing lots of work for us at a kind of low level, do we trust what happens when the transcription of a meeting isn't that accurate? That could have quite serious implications in particular circumstances. So we've got to keep remembering our fundamental principles about, the reliability, the accuracy of information, and the need to be critical and understand how our information environment works. This is still highly relevant. So all the stuff we do about information literacy seems to me even more useful and more important than ever before. And another point I made on the slide there is about, we've got to remember there's still kind of inequalities here. So maybe, my partner's from Hong Kong. The tools for translating Mandarin are brilliant, but for Cantonese, they're not so good. So what kind of inequalities are being created? It's typical, we need to think about these kind of things and help our users to continue to be critical. So that's definition one, and hopefully that kind of starts off on a kind of feeling reassured that we know about this already, but it's also an interesting area of change in our work at a low level. A second kind of definition is focusing more on the technologies that lie behind this kind of thing. So it's things like machine learning. So you take a computer, and rather than saying, okay, this is how you define a cat, this is how you define a dog, then the computer can differentiate the two. You give the computer some pictures marked up as cats, some marked up as dogs, and then it learns its own way of finding out how to correctly differentiate the two. So machine learning implies it can do something pretty clever of differentiating cats and dogs pictures, but we don't exactly know how it did it because we didn't code that. It hasn't been given a kind of general idea of how you define cats and dogs. It's come up with its own kind of pattern matching technique to make the differentiation. And then you've got things like natural language processing, the ability computers increasingly have to analyze text we write in social media or anything. Voice recognition, we're talking to our computers more and more. We talk to our Google Home, we talk to Alexa. Image recognition, I go out and I see a wildflower, I can take a picture of it and Google will tell me what it's a picture, what that flower's name is. Computers getting more and more good at recognizing different types of data. And if I've put a link in there to the JISC page, Explore AI, which I think is a really good thing to play around on. You can see lots of the kind of tools or the functions that these tools can offer. One I really like is you can paste in a document and it will generate a set of questions and answers derived from that document. I think as an educator, that's quite a neat little thing it can do for me. I'm not sure what the application is, but I think you can look at these tools that just can put out there and think, well, okay, how could I use that in my work? And when we look at those tools, I think the thing that is really going to stand out to us is things like applying this to medical images, say, but also more directly in our kind of work, it's like text mining the literature. I heard a while back, and I'm not sure the validity of this statement, but it said there was 500,000 published papers of research on type 2 diabetes. If that's the case, and it doesn't sound implausible to me, the amount of literature there is on any topic is so vast that we increasingly need to text mining tools to analyze the literature. We can't rely anymore on sort of manual approaches. So I think that's the kind of thing that should really excite us as information professionals, is possibilities to kind of really get to grips with the kind of explosion of literature that's happening out there, or the data that we've got. Also, there's things like chatbots and voice assistants. We can apply this potentially in our work. People have been talking about that for quite a long time, to be honest, but chatbot, I can see a real role for something like that, to answer 24/7 in a systematic way, low-level queries about when is the library open and that kind of thing. A voice assistant might enable people with dyslexia, say, who are kind of coming into a public library, say, to interact and get answers to their questions. So I think there's a lot of potential for these technologies to make knowledge more accessible, and that's what we're really about, isn't it? So on the second side, my slide, this is not magic. Sometimes it seems like magic, but it's not really magic. A lot of these tools, the whole Google use of data, of AI, etc., rely on having a lot of data, and I mean a lot of data. And maybe in our context, we don't always have that amount of data. It also involves a lot of training effort. If I'm going to train my computer to understand the difference between a cat and a dog, I've got to give it a lot of training data, and that means me going through a lot of pictures of cats and dogs, deciding which they are. And that's not a really particularly interesting task, but there's a lot of effort in training machine learning. Of course, there's this massive issue that we're probably very concerned with in contexts like health, of data bias. It's like, has the historic data we got really represent the population? Will it enable these exciting tools to really give us a valid answer to what we're asking? And then there's issues of data validity and ethics. I think I'm going to come back to a little bit. And then there's a little quote here from Mears and Seal's paper, which kind of takes me on to my third definition, really. So like, I think I'm very positive about our role in these technologies, but it's not because I think it's inevitable that the technologies come along and that the technology is going to solve all our problems. That is not the case. That's why we're important, because we're adding value in a way that often the technology solutions are just looking for a problem to solve, but they may not do it in a satisfactory way. And things like the things that we do, maybe, people come into our library because they want to talk to someone. The chatbot can give an answer, but can it give a reference interview? Probably not. So we mustn't forget all the good things that we do. And there is a kind of hype around technology that does downplay certain types of work, including the work of women, emotional labor and service. And my third definition of AI is a much more critical one. And I really recommend Crawford's work. Actually, you should say Crawford 2021. Where she kind of unpicks, well, how does something like Google Home really work? It seems to be just a technology that can answer all my questions, but how does it, what lies behind that? And she points out, well, okay, these technologies use a lot of energy. We're used to thinking of the digital as somehow costless, but actually the sustainability of particularly machine learning is kind of quite intensive in its use of computing power. And it could be that we need to think in terms of green AI. Equally, there's a whole kind of industrial infrastructure that lies behind how a simple kind of voice assistant works. Raw materials mined in often very exploitative ways, exploitative use of labor, and also our own data is being used as a kind of resource. And we know from recent court cases and so forth that maybe we don't trust these big corporations like Facebook, Amazon, and so forth to use our data in an appropriate way. It's quite exploitative how this is all works. So who's profiting? So I think we need to recognize that AI could also be seen as a global industrial complex, a quite exploitative one that isn't having a positive impact on global inequalities. So that's maybe another sort of definition of AI. And then the fourth definition is maybe the one that I kind of like the most, is like, okay, we've all got an idea of artificial intelligence. It's been around as an idea at least since the 1950s as a kind of technical aspiration to deliver something called artificial intelligence. But the idea of what intelligence is has evolved, and the idea of what technologies can deliver on that has evolved a lot. But even further, I think we've all been to films about artificial intelligence and thought about, oh, well, what happens when humans and AI interact, and can AI be trusted, and so forth. AI is really an idea. It's a social imaginary. It's a collective idea of our future with technology. And as such, as it's an idea, it's something we should influence and try and have an effect on, rather than sort of saying, oh, AI is a set of technologies we don't really understand, they're really going to change our lives. No, AI is an idea, and that we can input to what that idea means. That should be how we see it, I believe. So those were some attempts to define what artificial intelligence is. And maybe more usefully, I've also, in the report, spent a lot of time trying to think what, in practice, what are the different ways that AI could be used by information professionals? What kinds of things is it going to be used in? So some of it, so this is maybe my fifth definition, and maybe the more directly useful definition, I suppose. So think things like text summarization. If we're running a current awareness service or something like that, the fact that AI, we can use a little AI tool to make a bit of a summary of a text, that's really, really useful thing. But maybe we can use it in book ordering through some sort of recommendation system. There's also very simple kind of low-level things like robotic process automation, which is really just a kind of a way that you can link together a series of actions that can be triggered. And this can be a way to automate very simple tasks, routine tasks. I think there's some library work does tend to involve quite a lot of routine of, you know, get an email, as a result of that email, I have to grab some text, do a bit of a search, update a spreadsheet, and then send another email. Robotic process automation can do that kind of thing. So I think we should be playing around with these tools to see how we can exploit them in our own work. So that's one kind of area of application of AI. Another is directly in services. So increasingly, you know, we subscribe to bibliographic databases that actually have, they claim, AI functionality built in. Well, we've got to support that. But we could, as I was saying earlier, start thinking in terms of how do we help our users do text mining of the, you know, the exploding literature that they're trying to navigate. Or we might be developing a, you know, chatbot or voice assistant for information service users. These are all that this has become increasingly easy to do, because there's lots of kind of tools that don't require programming to kind of build your chatbot. So that's a kind of one set of possible ways we could apply AI. Another thing, I'm not sure how relevant, and this is more from the academic sector, but I mention it, it may be relevant to the health sector. And it's like, we've got communities of users within our organization who are getting more into data science. In the university context, it's digital humanists, it's social scientists, it's computer scientists, it's people from across the disciplines are all starting to use data science techniques in their research. So how can we support them? And I'm guessing in the health context too, there may be high, you know, people are doing their own research, starting to use data science techniques. How do we support them? And it can be things like, well, we're great at finding information. We've always been good at locating and searching for stuff. It's actually quite hard to find data sets. So it could be locating and licensing data sets for users. That could be something we could be doing. Or helping to create a community of data scientists. Certainly, I think there's a place, we might come back to this, is also supporting the wider use in the organization, because I believe information professionals have a quite unique kind of take on things that we'll come back to. We're a unique set of values that are of value. And if an organization is thinking about how we're going to use AI, they should be talking to us. We should be talking to them about how we can contribute to that process. It might be in terms of training users. It might be in terms of how the system is chosen, because we can bring in considerations that not everybody will think of. Certainly promoting data and AI literacy, I think, is something that could be part of our information literacy offering. In people that must understand how their data is used, how to manage their own data, how the monitoring of their data happens, how this might be used in decision making. I think that's something that maybe public libraries can do in terms of promoting citizenship literacy. But I think within organisations like NHS, I think we also need to, a spread of data literacy is quite an important thing that we need to be able to do. And finally, I think there is applications of AI to monitoring, predicting, influencing user behaviour, which is something I'm going to come back to a bit more in a moment. But I also, I'm going to pause for a second while I pull up my Padlet. So I'm hoping, I've done a little talking, you hopefully been prompted to think a little bit about how you might use AI in your own work. Let me just go back to sharing. So I've posted this Padlet link in the chat. On there, I've posed a couple of questions. One question is about, well, how do you think AI might be used in your work? What's the most obvious use? And then there's another question about what's the most transformative use do you think there might be of AI? So I'm hoping that this will give you an opportunity to put in your own opinions. So let me just, I think I will stop sharing for a moment.
Sorry, Andrew, I can't see the Padlet link in the chat.
Ah, okay. What have I done? Oh yes, I've just sent it to one person. I'm sorry. Yes, I think it should be in there now. I think you'll see it.
Yeah, I can see that. Thank you, Andrew.
Brilliant, thank you. So I don't know if I'm sure everyone's used Padlet, but when you open up Padlet, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little plus sign, and you click on that and you can create a little kind of post-it note, and then you can create your answer and then drag it across to underneath the question you're trying to answer. So you can see people are logging in. Maybe while people do that, I'll go back to sharing my screen.
And you want people just to add them to the 3 sections you've got?
Yeah, if people could do that, then we can, towards the end, we can have another look at it and just see what people are saying. So let me just, so I'll go back to talking, but people can look in the Padlet in the meantime. So my view of AI, as I've conveyed, is very, very positive, really. But there are obviously a lot of concerns around the kind of issues of the ethics of AI. I think an interesting way into this, I think, is thinking about this final use I talked about of using AI, which is to manage or understand users. So I think on the one hand, I mean, libraries are kind of incredibly rich in the data they have about users, you know, turnstile data, circulation data, the usage of digital resources, satisfaction surveys, not to mention all the qualitative research that we do into users to try and understand what they do. And I think this is one of the things I found in the report was a lot of people felt there's hype around AI, and the technologists don't really understand what they can solve a problem, but they don't know what the problem is. That they don't really understand user need. So I think that is why we have a critical role to play, because we do understand what people want, and we can understand how to design systems that will support users. So I think a strength that we have is the richness of the thinking and data we have about users, and that's really important. I think there's also some problem areas here when we start to use that data in particular types of way. And I go back to a debate that was very current in the educational sector about learning analytics. Now, I don't know how well this translates to the health context, but it may well do. So the issue here is that, yes, you could collect a lot of data about, say, students, and then use that to create personalized and adaptive services based on studying what they need. But there's quite a lot of kind of barriers to doing that in terms of from an ethical point of view. And then what I found was libraries have been toying around with the idea of learning analytics, but they tended not to have got consent from students. Students weren't aware of how their data was being used very much. Often this has been done without ethics review. Libraries weren't issuing responsible use statements about how they're going to use the data, and they weren't thinking, and this is kind of very central to, for example, NHSX's statement about, what ethical AI should be about. It's like, what's the benefit to the patient is got to be the driving force. But in the use of learning analytics, often the benefits were unclear. The technology is often driven by, we can do this, so we'll do it. But we've got to think more about what the benefit is to the user. And in the case of learning analytics, it often seems to be a benefit to the institution, not to the learner. And also there's kind of privacy issues, but also a kind of chilling effect. Once students think that they're being monitored, there's an effect on their freedom of expression, their willingness to search for things if they think they're being monitored. So I think we can collect a lot of data about users, but I think we have to be very careful about how we use it. So hopefully that debate resonates a little. And coming on to the question of the ethics of AI. A study from a couple of years ago found that already 84 statements from different international organizations and governments and tech companies about the ethics of AI. And there's some very common themes in that. One is about bias, which we've kind of already touched on, that issue of, if your data is biased, even if your algorithm isn't biased, if your data is biased, it's going to reproduce that bias. There's issues of transparency and accountability. So I talked about the way machine learning works is that you don't exactly know how it decides between a cat and a dog. You've just given it a training set, so it's worked out how to do it 100% of the time. But that means I can't explain very clearly what the process is. And there's issues about the graying of accountability. Who's accountable? And in the health context, this is kind of critical, isn't it? It's got to be transparent how AI is being used. It's got to be accountable if a wrong decision is made. Who is accountable for that? And then there's issues about, I've also already talked about privacy, the chilling effects of if we're monitoring what people are reading and searching for with a desire to help them search more effectively and make recommendations and so forth. That can also have negative effects in making people feel there's a surveillance system watching what they search, which is not helpful. And then there's issues around security and safety. We're gathering more and more data about people. So there's clearly a security issue and a safety issue created by this assembling of lots of data about people, and it can lead to de-anonymization. If you've got enough anonymous data, you can de-anonymize. I think the main point I want to draw out, so these are the general issues about AI, and I think if you look at what I would really recommend, another thing to read is the IFLA's statement on AI, which I think is a really distinctive voice among these many, many statements about AI, is talking about the information-specific issues that might arise from the application of artificial intelligence, such as, you know, what happens when my voice assistant that I've trained to answer people's questions doesn't really understand everybody who talks to it. It can understand a kind of, you know, my white male voice, which has been trained on, but it can't understand everybody's voices. You know, that's not really going to work. What about my automated moderation on social media? If it starts either letting in content it shouldn't or blocking content that's legitimate. I think there's a lot of issues around freedom of expression, freedom of access to data that we as information professionals are always thinking about, that aren't always part of the debate about the ethics of AI. So I think we have, my point really is that we have a distinctive thing to say in the context of that debate. On the Padlet, there was a third column which was asking you to think about the challenges of AI. What do you think the biggest challenges are? I've listed some here. Obviously, there's things like privacy. We've just been talking about the ethics. There's GDPR. There's the hype, there's the over-promising. Do we see it as really our lack of skills? Or is it because other people own the agenda? Is it because in our organizations, we see a wider fear of technology, a fear of culture change? Or is it simply that, number 12 there, we've got so much else to do? It doesn't really, really helpful for me to come along and say, oh, well, you've got to find out all about AI now. You've got many other things to do that could be more of a priority. So I think it's interesting I'll be interested to see what people are writing on our slide there about, on our Padlet, about what they think the issues are. The second part of my talk really is, again, a kind of positive statement about, well, what can we as information professionals offer in the data and AI space. So some scholars, particularly the Suskins, quite famously, basically said, oh, well, professions are going to be replaced by computers. It's the end of the profession. Others were much more, like Frey and Osborne, another equally seminal work, have sort of said, well, no, actually it's just routine work that will disappear. Although I don't know what exactly routine work means in that context. So how will AI affect our job? Will we be replaced, or will we be controlled by computers, or will there be a division between those who got the skills and those who haven't? Or can we use it to our advantage? Well, I'm hoping that we can. I think in black here, I've kind of listed some of the things that we already do. We do information management, we do collection management, and the kind of ways of thinking that we apply in those contexts seem to be highly relevant to AI, partly because AI is basically premised on having loads of data. So you need data governance, you need data standards, you need to think in terms of metadata and preservation and those things. So I think what we know about managing information, creating collections, we need data collections. And so our collection management skills are really relevant. I think a point I keep making, perhaps too much, but I think the landscape of search for data is very, very challenging, and that we can offer a lot of support there, maybe. Also, there's a lot of issues around intellectual property rights and copyright, and that's an area we historically have been, people turn to us for that advice, and it's highly relevant in a data context. teaching data and AI literacy. That seems to me to another dimension of information literacy. And ultimately, I think we have this knowledge of users' need that's really important to picking the AI applications that are really useful to users and not just going along with what the latest technology says we should be doing. So I think we've got a lot of relevant skills and knowledge. I think we've also got a lot of relevant attitudes. The fact that you've come along today and we come together as a professional group to share knowledge, that's something that not every, I mean, data science as an emerging profession doesn't really have that community sense. So our ability to learn off each other, to copy ideas from each other, that's really valuable for us to respond to things like artificial intelligence. But I also think our collaborative skills are really important. And although it's not the only answer to what the fourth industrial revolution, if you want to call that, needs in terms of skills, I think it's really instructive to look at this World Economic Forum listing of the kind of skills they say are key to this digital transformation. And if you look at them, they're actually not technical skills. I'm pretty sure we do need better technical skills. I know that's a big part of the Topple report, that we do need those things. But look there, they're mostly things I think I would say librarians are really good at: emotional intelligence, service orientation, negotiation, flexibility. These are things that we can bring to the table and are really valuable in the context of artificial intelligence. And then there's values and a vision. So we've already talked a bit about how the IFLA statement on AI ethics, I think, has a distinctive view on what is important. I've reproduced here Silip's ethical statement. I think a lot of what is said there is relevant to an AI world, but not always realized by a lot of the players or the stakeholders in AI initiatives. On the right-hand side of the slide there, I've mentioned a few things I think we have to think a bit more about. For example, we certainly as a profession are committed to equality, diversity of access, of avoidance of bias. But I think we need to think more about how data inequality is reproduced through data. That's something perhaps we haven't thought about. Again, we tend to think of digital solutions as always being kind of green because they don't have, but they do have sustainability aspects. We should be thinking about global south perspectives because a lot of this AI stuff comes from global north. So I think there's some questions we need to ask about our values, but I think they remain really important and relevant. And I picked up from NHSX's guide to good practice for digital and data-driven health technologies. A few things I thought, I highlighted there. I think we know about these things. So ensure that the product is designed to achieve a clear outcome for users or the system. And it seems to me, that is exactly, we've got that service user focus that not everybody has. We have got to focus on accessibility and making things easier to use. That's the third point. And we also need to be clear about the limitations of data. So I talked about, I should have said more about data validity in the learning analytics debate. The question is, we can measure all sorts of things people do while they're learning, but it's not really measuring learning in the sense of, well, has someone learned something? So I think we need to think hard about what data is valid. And I think there's a weakness in the technologists will tend to just grab hold of the data and do something with it because they can do very clever things with lots of data. But we need to be stopping to say, well, where did that data come from? How was that data created? What's the limits of that data? What can that data read? How far can that be pushed? So And then I guess my final slide is going beyond our skills and our knowledge and our attitudes and our values, is thinking about a vision. So I said, I think AI is an idea. If it's an idea, then it's one we can influence. We can make, kind of say what the best idea of AI should be. So a few years ago, we wrote a kind of paper where we talked about the idea of the intelligent library, moving from searching to find a text to read manually, to interacting with the full text of a whole library collection. Maybe that could be our kind of vision of what we're trying to achieve. I think in the context of there being loads of fantastic technologies out there, the people with the vision have got a lot of power, because we can say, this is what we want to achieve. The technologies don't know. They can do the technology, but they don't know what it's for a lot of the time. Another vision might be, and this, I think this came out in the report, or the interviews for the report, very much that the idea of the living systematic review is one that is quite powerful in the health context, and the idea that we can maybe use AI to systematize some parts of a systematic review so it can be updated automatically and then linked through to advice for treating patients arising from that systematic review. But I think whether those visions appeal to you or not, the key thing is have a vision of what AI could do for you. That would be my main message from my talk. And I think the way to do that is to go back to, I was talking about the JISC side, where you can play around on different technologies and just think about, well, what could this do for my information service? Well, I think these are very powerful technologies to help us increase access to knowledge. And that's what we're all about. So I think it's a very exciting time for us, potentially, if we can formulate a vision and persuade others to go along with that. So I suppose my sort of closing question would be, what's your vision of a library powered by AI? What do you think that would look like? And at that point, I think I'll stop sharing. We can have a look maybe at people have put a lot of stuff into the Padlet, which is fantastic. We can spend a bit of time going through that if people want to, or if people got specific questions, perhaps we could.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So there hasn't been anything added to the chat at the moment. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question direct to Andrew, that's fine. But if you can respond to his questions in the chat as well, that would be excellent. Would it be useful just to have a look at the Padlet just to see if that prompts any questions from people?
So I think I'm sharing the Padlet now.
You are, thank you.
Yeah. So I think, what are we seeing there? Summarizing articles, somebody's put there, definitely systematic review and research support, focus to researchers. A chatbot would allow 24/7 responses to queries. Definitely all these things are kind of exciting possibilities for us, I think. Let's have a look at the middle column, which is like the most transformational uses of AI. So somebody's saying they're text mining the literature, and I think personally, it's got to be something in that area. But other people are saying to save on tedious tasks, doing routine. I think that is also, could free us up to do more interesting work. Auto alerts for monitoring complex topics. That sounds like a really, really cool idea. Expanding the role of the information professional. I like the sound of that. Definitely good. If anybody wants to come in and ask a question or kind of follow up on something they've written in one of the Padlet boxes, that'd be really good. And then we've got a lot of challenges. So we've got privacy, we've got lack of skills, we've got whether the IT teams can support us, we've got overload. We've got these concerns that professionals will become redundant. I think there's a lot of focus there on our skills. But I come back to my fundamental argument. I think this is just another wave of something we've been seeing for a while. Maybe we're pioneers of digital transformation more than we think. And I think that we have a lot of relevant knowledge. It's more about adding to what we don't think in terms of, I've got to become a data scientist, I've got to become an AI expert. I think it's got to be able to talk to the data scientists is the key thing, really. Just wondering if anybody else, I seem to do a lot of talking here, but
you've had a couple of comments in the chat, I think, in answer to your question about how people see AI have an impact on their work and their service. We've got one saying that using AI should have an active library should be an active part of this landscape. For example, being involved in systematic reviews and not just in a support role. So that's seeing a more of a important active role, and then also that AI should be purpose-driven rather than technology-driven. So you need a reason to use it rather than just because it happens to be there, I suspect.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. There is this notion now, they call it technological solutionism. It's like technology, perhaps being developed in another sector, it could be applied to our work. Great, but let's build that on the basis of what we already understand what users need.
And I just noticed from the pad that there was a comment about interested to know if the green element of AI is a plus or a negative, which I guess is a question.
Yeah, that is a key question. I mean, AI can obviously be applied to solving climate change issues, but equally AI itself uses a lot of energy. So I'm aware that there's some conferences now that you have to have a green statement to go with your paper about your algorithm to show that you've thought about how to minimize the kind of environmental impact of your own technology. So I think maybe an increasing part of evaluating systems may be to ask this kind of question. So we're buying a technology, we want to know what is the environmental impact. I think that'll be an increasing question that we will be asking.
Thank you. And then we've had a further comment to say the feeling that there's a danger of AI compounding inequalities when it's based on data that is already biased at the outset, which I think alludes to your comment earlier in your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a big danger. Again, if we think about it in terms of people coming from a technological solutionist perspective, it's like, we've got the technology, we can apply it to your data. There needs to be a lot of thought go into how biased data might be and to work out how to approach dealing with that. So that thinking has to be built into the process of applying AI. So I think it's another area where we can help because we're asking those kind of questions. If we keep asking those questions rather than let the technologists just tell us how AI is going to be used.
Yes, and if you're aware of that problem, at least you can challenge the data, not just take it as gospel, etc. Okay, has anybody got any questions they want to ask direct? You can come off mute, I think, and ask Andrew. We've got a couple of minutes left. No, is everyone done? I think you've wowed everybody into silence, Andrew. So, but thank you ever so much for such an interesting and stimulating talk. I certainly learned a lot myself, and I'm sure people will need time to think about it and etc. And so they may come back and have further thoughts about it later. So thank you ever so much for coming and talking to us about that. Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to put the breakout link in the chat. So if